Alexander was born in a kingdom called Macedonia. It was a rugged land of mountains and brave warriors. His father was King Philip II, a strong and clever ruler. Philip had built Macedonia into the most powerful state in Greece. He created a new kind of army, with long spears called sarissas. This army was feared by all its enemies. Alexander grew up watching his father lead this mighty force. He learned about war and leadership from a very young age. He saw how his father united the Greek city-states, sometimes through battle, and sometimes through clever words. Alexander knew he was destined for a life of great importance, following in the footsteps of a powerful king. As a young boy, Alexander was full of energy and curiosity. He was not just interested in fighting, he loved to learn. His father hired the most famous teacher in the world for him, the philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle taught Alexander about many things. He learned about plants and animals, stars and planets, and how to think clearly and logically. This education was very important. It made Alexander a leader who could think deeply about his plans. He was not just a brute warrior, he was a man with a sharp mind. This combination of physical strength and intellectual power would make him a truly unique and formidable figure in history. One of the most famous stories about young Alexander involves a wild horse. A magnificent black stallion named Bucephalus was brought to his father's court. No one could tame the horse. It was too wild and kicked at anyone who came near. King Philip was ready to send the horse away. But Alexander, still a boy, asked for a chance. He noticed that the horse was afraid of its own shadow. He calmly turned the horse to face the sun, so its shadow was behind it. Then he spoke gently and mounted the horse. He rode Bucephalus that day, and the horse became his loyal companion for many years, carrying him through many great battles. This story shows the kind of person Alexander was. He was observant, patient, and fearless. He did not use force when intelligence would work better. These qualities were signs of the great commander he would become. His childhood was not just about lessons in a classroom or games in the palace. It was a complete preparation for a life of leadership. He learned from his father, his teacher, and his own experiences. He was a prince who was ready for anything. The world was about to see what this young man from the small kingdom of Macedonia was capable of achieving when his time came to rule. Alexander's time to rule came much sooner than anyone expected. It happened in a sudden and violent way. His father, King Philip II, had achieved his great goal of uniting the Greek city-states under his leadership. He was planning a massive invasion of the Persian Empire, the largest and richest empire in the world. A great celebration was held to honor his achievements and to prepare for the coming war. There was a grand festival with parades and games. King Philip walked into a theater full of confidence and pride, but in that moment of triumph, tragedy struck. One of his own bodyguards rushed forward and stabbed the king, killing him instantly. The court was thrown into chaos. Alexander, who was only 20 years old, was right there when his father died. It was a dangerous time for him. He had rivals who also wanted the throne. His mother, Olympias, acted quickly to secure his position. The army, which was the most powerful force in Macedonia, had to choose the next king. The soldiers had watched Alexander grow up. They had seen his courage and his skill. They remembered his bravery in battle, fighting alongside his father. They trusted him to be a strong leader just like Philip. The generals raised him on their shields and declared him the new king of Macedonia. But becoming king was only the first challenge. The lands that his father had conquered did not want to stay under Macedonian rule. As soon as they heard of Philip's death, many cities in Greece rebelled. They thought a young king like Alexander would be weak and easy to defeat. They were wrong. Alexander moved with incredible speed. He marched his army south into Greece before the rebels could organize. He showed both mercy and strength. To the city of Thebes, which had led the rebellion, he showed no mercy at all. He destroyed the city completely, a harsh lesson to anyone else who dared to oppose him. This swift and brutal action sent a clear message to the rest of the Greek world. Alexander was not a boy to be trifled with. He was a powerful and determined king, just as strong as his father, if not more so. He quickly re-established control over all of Greece. The other cities, seeing what happened to Thebes, quickly swore their loyalty to him. With Greece once again secure, Alexander could turn his attention back to his father's great plan. The dream of conquering the vast Persian Empire was still alive. Now it was his dream to fulfill, and he was ready to lead his army into Asia. With his kingdom secure, Alexander turned his eyes eastward, toward the vast lands of the Persian Empire. This was not just a sudden idea, it was a mission he inherited from his father. For many years, the Greeks had a long and bitter history with Persia. The Persians had invaded Greece a century before, burning cities like Athens. Although the Greeks had fought them off, the memory of this invasion was still strong. King Philip had planned his own invasion as a great act of revenge. He wanted to punish the Persians for their past actions and to liberate the Greek cities that were still under Persian rule in Asia Minor, what is now modern-day Turkey. Alexander shared this desire for revenge, but his vision was even bigger. He was inspired by the heroic tales of ancient Greek heroes like Achilles, his supposed ancestor. He saw the conquest of Persia as a chance to achieve immortal glory. He wanted to do something that no one had ever done before. The Persian Empire was enormous, stretching from Egypt to India. It was immensely wealthy, with cities full of gold and treasures. Conquering it would make Alexander the most powerful and richest ruler on earth. It was a challenge of epic proportions, and Alexander was a man who loved a great challenge. There were also practical reasons for the invasion. The Macedonian kingdom needed wealth to maintain its large and expensive army. Conquering Persia would provide the money needed to pay his soldiers and fund his ambitions. It would also give land and opportunity to thousands of his followers. For the Greek city-states, it was a way to unite them against a common enemy. Instead of fighting each other, they could join Alexander in a grand campaign against the Persians. He presented the invasion as a pan-Hellenic crusade, a war for all Greeks, led by him as their chosen commander. So in the spring of 334 BC, Alexander gathered his army. It was a force of about 40,000 soldiers, a mix of Macedonians and Greeks. It was not a huge army compared to the vast forces the Persians could gather, but it was highly trained and fiercely loyal. He left one of his most trusted generals, Antipater, in charge of Macedonia and Greece. Then he led his men across the Hellespont, the narrow strait of water that separates Europe from Asia. As he stepped onto Asian soil, he threw a spear into the ground. This was a symbolic act. He was claiming Asia as his own, a land given to him by the gods. Soon after crossing into Asia, Alexander faced his first major test. The local Persian governors, known as satraps, had gathered an army to stop him. They chose to make their stand at the Granicus River. The Persian force was a mix of cavalry and Greek mercenaries, soldiers who fought for pay. They positioned themselves on the high, steep bank of the river, believing this gave them a strong defensive advantage. They thought Alexander would not dare to attack them across the water and up the muddy slope. It seemed like a foolish risk for any commander to take, but Alexander was no ordinary commander. Ignoring the advice of his older, more cautious generals who suggested waiting until the next day, Alexander decided to attack immediately. He believed that any sign of hesitation would be seen as weakness by the enemy. He wanted to show the Persians that he was bold and unstoppable. He personally led the charge of his elite companion cavalry across the river. The water was deep and the current was strong. As they struggled up the slippery bank, the Persians rained down javelins and arrows upon them. It was a chaotic and desperate fight at the water's edge. Alexander was in the thick of the battle, fighting at the front like a common soldier. His bright armor and helmet made him an easy target. At one point, a Persian nobleman charged at him, swinging a heavy axe. The blow struck Alexander's helmet, nearly splitting it in two and dazing him. Just as another Persian was about to deliver a killing blow, one of Alexander's friends, Cletus the Black, rode up and cut off the attacker's arm, saving the king's life. Despite the danger, Alexander's fearless leadership inspired his men. They fought with incredible ferocity, pushing the Persians back from the riverbank. Once the Macedonian cavalry secured a foothold on the other side, the rest of the army, including the disciplined phalanx, began to cross. The Persian cavalry line broke under the relentless pressure and fled the battlefield. The Greek mercenaries who had been fighting for Persia were left surrounded. Alexander showed them no mercy. He saw them as traitors to the Greek cause. Most were slaughtered where they stood. The victory at the Battle of Granicus was complete and overwhelming. It was a stunning first success that opened the way for Alexander to advance into the heart of Asia Minor. After his victory at Granicus, Alexander and his army marched south along the coast of Asia Minor. liberating Greek cities as they went. The Persian king, Darius III, was now taking the threat seriously. He gathered a massive army from all corners of his empire to crush the young Macedonian invader. The two forces finally met near a town called Issus, on a narrow coastal plain. The terrain was very important. The plain was squeezed between mountains on one side and the sea on the other. This narrow space prevented Darius from using his much larger number of soldiers effectively. It was a mistake that would cost him dearly. Darius was so confident of victory that he brought his entire royal court with him, including his mother, his wife, and his children. They were there to witness his glorious triumph over the Macedonians. He positioned his army across the plain, with his best troops in the center. Alexander, when he saw the Persian army, realized the opportunity the narrow battlefield gave him. He arranged his own forces carefully, placing his best cavalry, the companions, on the right wing, which he would lead himself. His plan was not just to defeat the Persian army, but to capture or kill King Darius himself. The battle began with a thunderous charge. Alexander led his cavalry at an angle toward the Persian left wing. His goal was to create a gap in the enemy line. As the Persians shifted to meet his charge, the gap opened. Alexander immediately wheeled his horsemen and charged directly at the center of the Persian line, where Darius was standing in his magnificent war chariot. The fighting around the king's chariot was fierce and bloody. Darius, a king who was not used to being in the middle of a real fight, saw the terrifying Macedonian cavalry getting closer and closer, led by the determined young Alexander. Panic seized the Persian king. Fearing for his own life, Darius turned his chariot around and fled the battlefield as fast as he could. When the rest of the Persian army saw their king running away, their courage broke. The entire army dissolved into a panicked mob, all trying to escape at once. The Macedonians pursued them, causing a terrible slaughter. The victory was total. Alexander had not only defeated the great king's army, but he had also captured the royal camp, including Darius's family. He treated them with great respect and kindness, a gesture that surprised many. The Battle of Issus proved that Alexander could defeat the very best the Persian Empire had to offer. Even after the humiliating defeat at Issus, Darius III was not ready to give up his empire. He escaped and spent the next 2 years gathering another, even larger army. He learned from his mistake at Issus and chose a battlefield that would favor his numbers. Darius selected a wide, flat plain near a village called Gaugamela in what is now northern Iraq. He even had the ground leveled to make it perfect for his war chariots and his vast cavalry forces. This time, there would be no narrow spaces to help the Macedonians. Darius was determined to use his numerical superiority to surround and destroy Alexander's army once and for all. Alexander's army was heavily outnumbered, perhaps by 3 or 4 to 1. On the night before the battle, his generals were nervous. One of them, Parmenion, suggested a surprise night attack to confuse the larger Persian force. Alexander rejected the idea, famously saying, "I will not steal my victory." He wanted to defeat Darius in a fair fight in broad daylight, so that there could be no doubt about who was the superior commander. He spent the evening resting and preparing his plan. He was confident in the skill and discipline of his soldiers and in his own ability to lead them. The next day, the battle began. Alexander advanced with his army at an angle, just as he had at Issus. This drew the Persian cavalry on their left wing out to the side, trying to envelop the smaller Macedonian force. This was exactly what Alexander had anticipated. As the Persian line stretched and thinned to prevent being outflanked, a gap opened up near the center, close to where Darius was once again stationed. This was the moment Alexander had been waiting for. He formed his elite companion cavalry into a giant wedge and led a decisive charge directly into that gap, aiming straight for Darius. The scene from Issus repeated itself, but on a much grander scale. The charge of Alexander's cavalry was unstoppable. It smashed through the Persian royal guards and bore down on Darius. For the second time, the great king of Persia lost his nerve and fled the field. His flight once again caused a widespread panic that shattered the morale of his army. While part of the Macedonian army under Parmenion was in trouble on the left flank, Alexander, after chasing Darius for a short time, made a difficult choice. He gave up the pursuit of the king to return and help his struggling soldiers, securing a complete victory across the entire battlefield. Gaugamela was the final, decisive blow. The Persian army was scattered, and the road to the great cities of Babylon and Persepolis was now open. After the victory at Gaugamela, Alexander was effectively the new ruler of the Persian Empire. He marched into the legendary cities of Babylon and Susa, which surrendered to him without a fight. The people welcomed him, tired of Darius's rule. Alexander showed that he was not just a conqueror, but also a clever statesman. Instead of destroying their culture and traditions, he respected them. In Babylon, he made sacrifices to the local gods, earning the goodwill of the powerful priests. He kept many of the local Persian governors and officials in their positions, using their experience to help him rule his new, vast empire. His policy was one of fusion, an attempt to blend Greek and Persian cultures together. He wanted to create a new unified empire where people from different backgrounds could live and work together. He encouraged his soldiers to marry Persian women, and he himself married Roxana, a princess from the eastern region of Bactria. He also started adopting some Persian customs. He began to wear Persian-style clothing and introduced Persian court ceremonies, such as requiring visitors to bow down before him. This was a practice known as proskynesis, and it was controversial. His Macedonian and Greek soldiers were not happy about these changes. They saw themselves as conquerors, not as equals to the people they had defeated. They were proud of their own culture and did not want to adopt the customs of their former enemies. Bowing down before another man, even a king, was something that Greeks only did for their gods. This caused tension and resentment between Alexander and his most loyal veterans. They felt he was becoming too much like an Eastern king and forgetting his Macedonian roots. There were plots against his life, which he dealt with harshly. Despite these tensions, Alexander continued with his vision. He founded many new cities throughout his empire, most of them named Alexandria. The most famous of these was Alexandria in Egypt, which would become a great center of learning and trade for centuries. These cities were designed to be melting pots of culture, with Greek colonists living alongside the local population. He hoped these cities would be the foundation of his new blended civilization. Alexander's goal was no longer just to conquer the world, but to unite it under his rule, creating a bridge between the East and the West. Alexander's ambition knew no bounds. Even after conquering the entire Persian Empire, he was not satisfied. He had heard stories of the incredible lands of India, at the very edge of the known world. He wanted to see these lands for himself and add them to his empire. He led his army eastward from Persia, into the rugged and unfamiliar territories of what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan. This part of his journey was incredibly difficult. His army had to cross vast, waterless deserts under a burning sun, and then climb over the towering, snow-capped mountains of the Hindu Kush. The soldiers, who had been away from their homes for many years, began to grow weary. They faced not only the harshness of the environment, but also constant resistance from fierce local tribes who were expert guerrilla fighters. In India, they encountered things they had never seen before, such as powerful war elephants used in battle. At the Battle of the Hydaspes River, Alexander fought one of his toughest battles against an Indian king named Porus and his army of elephants. Although Alexander won another brilliant victory, his own army suffered heavy losses, and the experience was terrifying for his men and their horses. After this battle, Alexander wanted to push even further east, to the great Ganges River. But his army had finally reached its limit. The soldiers were exhausted from years of marching and fighting. They were homesick and demoralized by the relentless monsoon rains that turned the land into a sea of mud. They had heard stories that the armies waiting for them beyond the Ganges were even larger and more powerful than any they had faced before. At the banks of the Hyphasis River, his army mutinied. They refused to go any further. For the first time, his men would not follow his command. Alexander was furious and disappointed. He shut himself in his tent for 3 days, but his men would not change their minds. Finally, he had to accept their decision. He agreed to turn back. However, he chose a new and even more dangerous route for the return journey. He split his army, sending part of it back by sea, while he led the rest through the brutal Gedrosian Desert, one of the driest and hottest places on Earth. Thousands of his soldiers, along with their families who followed the army, died from thirst and heat exhaustion during this terrible march. It was a final, grueling hardship on their long journey home. After the harrowing journey through the desert, Alexander and the remains of his army finally returned to the heart of his empire in Persia. He was only 32 years old, but the years of constant campaigning had taken a toll on him. He began to organize his vast empire and plan for future expeditions, including a possible invasion of Arabia, but he would never get the chance to lead his army again. In the city of Babylon, in the summer of 323 BC, Alexander fell ill after a long banquet and drinking party. He developed a high fever that lasted for days, and his strong body grew weaker and weaker. His soldiers, hearing that their king was dying, were filled with grief. They were allowed to file past his bed to see him one last time. He was too weak to speak, but he acknowledged them with a movement of his hand. Soon after, Alexander the Great, the conqueror of the known world, died. The exact cause of his death is still a mystery. Some historians believe he died from a disease like malaria or typhoid fever, while others suspect he might have been poisoned by his rivals. Whatever the cause, his sudden death left his enormous empire without a clear leader. When his generals asked him on his deathbed to whom he left his kingdom, he is said to have whispered, "To the strongest." This answer guaranteed that his empire would not survive him. His most powerful generals, known as the Diadochi or successors, immediately began fighting among themselves for control. For the next 40 years, they waged a series of brutal wars that tore Alexander's empire apart. In the end, it was divided into several new kingdoms, including the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Asia, and the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia. His dream of a united world died with him. Despite the collapse of his empire, Alexander's legacy endured. He is remembered as one of the greatest military geniuses in all of history. His tactics are still studied in military academies today. His conquests spread Greek language, culture, and ideas across a vast area, a process known as Hellenization. This blending of Greek and Eastern cultures created a vibrant new Hellenistic world that lasted for centuries and had a profound influence on the development of Western civilization. Though his life was short, Alexander's actions reshaped the world, and his name became a symbol of ambition, glory, and legendary achievement that continues to inspire and fascinate people even now.